The Woman in the Veil by E.F. Benson. It was a joyful spectacle, as the great train roared westward, to watch the clearing of the skies, which in London for the last week had dripped with chilly, relentless rain. Before we reached the first halt at Exeter, the floor of the compact grey clouds had been rent in a dozen places, and gleams of sunshine lay in golden patches over the landscape. Swiftly, after that, the rags of vapour which hung onto the heavens were shrivelled and consumed in that genial fire, and by the time we struck the coast near Dawlish, the radiance of the May afternoon poured down brilliantly on a sea of peacock blues and greens on the rich red earth of the cliffs. Soon we clanked across the Saltash Bridge, and after a delectable travel through the beech woods sown with bluebells, and passages over spiderweb viaducts slung above the tree-tops of the gashed valleys below, came to a station of soft-sounding Cornish name, where I had to change for the branch line to Poltreath. Here the country became of a more austere aspect, and of a brisker air, for a westerly breeze was blowing, laden with the salt freshness of the Atlantic, and on an evening of unclouded splendour I got out at the little town that clustered steeply on the sides of a dip in the uplands. Half a mile of huddled streets brought me on to the open downs, on the edge of which stood the square, grey-stoned Beach Hotel, for which I was bound. Like every proper Londoner, I took advantage of all possible reasons for flying from the town, which I adored so deeply, and two such, irresistible in their combination, had just presented themselves. One was that I had to do some work which required a week of seclusion and serious spade work. The other that painters were proposing to make my house uninhabitable for some days. A remote hotel was, therefore, a desirable refuge. By chance, I'd seen in the weather reports that Poltreath was enjoying insolently long hours of sunshine, and since I had pleasant recollections of that coast generally, but had never seen the place itself, that was a reason the more for now doing so. Somewhere in the darker pools of my mind was the knowledge that I'd heard of Poltreath quite lately in some special connection, but though I'd been intermittently fishing for it all day, I could not arrive at it. Perhaps I'd seen a picture of it in some illustrated paper. Perhaps there'd been a wreck on its coast. Perhaps somebody had gone round its golf links in wholly incredible figures. My knowledge seemed to me to be of this class, merely of an incident with which I was in no way connected, but which had just caught, though not held, my attention. But what the incident connected with it was, I had no idea. It was impossible to imagine a more delightfully situated lodging for one who loved sea and sun and was in need of solitude. The big grey hotel, once clearly a country house, was planted foursquare close to the edge of the cliffs that tumbled down to the beach. On one side of it was scooped a broad, sandy bay. In front and on the other side, a fringe of sharp-toothed rocks bordered the sea. Round it was spread the maritime downs, short-turfed and starred with pink clusters of thrift, across which the coast road ran north and south. Before it was spread the Atlantic. Bleak and desolate it might indeed be when the gales of winter boomed from the southwest, and the few trees that grow about it, dwarfed in height and bent landwards with crooked trunks and oblique branches, showed that such winds were prevalent. But this evening only the lightest of airs streamed in from the sea, and the water, far out across the sands, was scarcely rimmed with white. The air was of the most exhilarating vintage, provocative of activity both in mind and in body, and looking at sun-steeped sea and the smooth-turfed golf links that lay across the bay, I regretted that most of my activity would be concerned to exercise itself with a pen plunged in ink, instead of shoulders in the sea and with delvings for words rather than golf balls. But quickly I made myself a bargain, which the most scrupulous conscience would approve. My mornings should be long and studious, so too my evenings. I vowed that every night after dinner I'd settle down for 3 solid hours of work. That would make a full day of industry, and thus from lunchtime to dinner I should be free to enjoy the sands and sun and sea of Poltreath. I inaugurated that dutiful programme at once, and till dinner scrambled about the rocks below the hotel, recapturing again the magic that lurks in rock pools, those entrancing lakes of clearest water, fringed with seaweed, the home of sideways scuttling crabs and strawberry-like anemones of the sea. Never have I seen such ranges of rocks as here, such fruitful pools, such sequestered little beaches of sand tucked away in valleys, guarded by mussel-covered crags, exposed now at the ebb of the tide. Then came dinner in a sparsely populated dining room, for the seaside season was not yet in full swing, and after that I went to my sitting room for the other branch of my programme. This was on the ground floor, a small slip of a place opening out of that apartment known to hotels and house agents as the lounge, where a wireless apparatus, to my deep satisfaction, was telling us, even as the sun, near its setting over the sea, poured light and warmth on us, that rain had been incessant all day in London and was likely to continue. Then, with a profound sense of rectitude, I turned my back on the window and sat down to work. Daylight faded, and without drawing my blind I switched on the lights. As a reward of my industry I'd got absorbed in my tale, and when, after an unestimated interval, I heard a clock in the lounge outside strike a lengthy hour, I was astonished to find that it was already midnight. That was full measure of my work, and I dropped my pen and wheeled around in my chair to look at the night. Tranquil it was, and brilliant. A moon, a day from the full, blazed whitely on the expanse of the sea, turning it to a sheet of twinkling silver. For foreground there was a narrow strip of downland, and then the edge of the cliff. Close outside my windows ran a broad gravel walk. I suddenly became aware that there was standing on it, not more than a couple of yards distant, the figure of a woman, dressed in a long coat with a motor veil tied around her head. She was looking into the windows of the lounge, and was thus almost directly in full face to me, but her face was in shadow, and I couldn't see it at all distinctly. She seemed to have very large or very prominent eyes. Her mouth drooped open, and she was very dark of complexion. But the lights, and even more the shadows of moonlight, are very confusing. Pink and topaz, black and red, brown and purple are indistinguishable in it. But certainly this middle-aged lady with pronounced features was dark. And then her presence there and her strange immobility struck me as odd, startling even. I was sure she hadn't been at dinner. What then was she doing just outside the hotel? Then the very natural explanation occurred to me, that she'd just arrived now by car, and like myself was enjoying this rare spectacle of sea and moonshine. I pulled down my blind, quenched the light, and went out into the lounge on my way bedwards. It was already empty, with only a solitary light burning, and at the far end of it was the night porter, locking and bolting the front door. He'd just finished with this when I came to the foot of the staircase, and he offered me the accommodation of the lift. And then it occurred to me that he'd locked out this motoring lady. "Surely you're locking someone out," I said. "Hasn't a lady in a motor just arrived?" "No, sir, no arrival," he said. The memory of that figure looking in at the window of the lounge began to interest me. "But I saw a woman on the path just outside my window 2 minutes ago," I said. He looked at me, a little puzzled, a little bored, but with some glint of interest, or was it of unease? "Can't be anybody from here," he said. "No one's gone out since I came on duty, and none's arrived. Some visitor from Poltreath, sir. There's a right of way all along the cliffs." I bade him good night and went upstairs. From the open gallery of the floors above, I saw that he'd gone to the window at the end of the lounge, and was looking out. Alas for the sunny serenity of Poltreath! During the night I heard the wind awake, and in the morning a gale laden with rain was battering on my panes. Yet that made my industries but the easier, for who would want to be abroad in this tempest? But after lunch the rain ceased, and tiring of the house I set forth along the coast road, northward. The wind was tremendous on the upland, and it was a relief, after a mile of buffeting, to dip into a valley where the force of it was cut off by a headland seawards. There was a very vale of Avilion. Copses lined the road, thick with primroses and bluebells and birdsong. But soon it began to mount again, and at the corner just ahead of me I saw from the gestures of the struggling trees that I should emerge into the full blast. I said to myself that I'd just walk to that point, and then turn homewards. I came to this corner, and then, quite suddenly, I found I knew the place, not from having been here before, but from some picture which I'd seen quite recently. There was a steep spur of rock a sharp angle in the road, and a glimpse of the sea. At that, the solution of what had intermittently puzzled me the day before was manifest. It was just here, at this very corner, that a week before there'd appeared in some illustrated paper the picture of a motor car standing empty in the road, and with a rush of retarded recollection the whole memory linked itself up. Miss Alice Trellings, that iron-willed and ruthless explorer of unknown lands, had been staying at Bude and had set out alone one evening after dinner to drive to Poltreath, where she had engaged rooms at the Beach Hotel. She had never appeared there, nor had she been seen since, but at this corner had been found her motor, facing not towards Poltreath, but in the direction from which she'd come. Before now she had suffered more than one attack of loss of memory, due to a sunstroke while crossing the Arabian desert, and the theory of the police had been that, feeling the approach of some such seizure, she had turned back and then, at its onset, left the car. It was known that she was wearing a string of very valuable pearls, but it was difficult to imagine that a thief had boarded the car while in motion, had killed her, and had disposed of the body. Loss of memory and identity while seeking the place where she was known was a far more probable theory. So there was the memory I'd been fishing for. It was a certain satisfaction to have caught and landed it, but its connection with Poltreath was of the most shadowy, and thinking no more about it, I pressed my way homewards. Already the sea had risen angrily under the violence of the gale, and was whitened with breaking wave crests, while the great rollers were riding in, pounding the rocky coast. The spouts of foam rose high in the air, and blown landwards by the wind, hissed as they fell on the grass above the cliffs. I'd scarcely got into the shelter of the hotel when again the rain began to stream against the window of my room. With the close of the day the hurly-burly redoubled. Squalls descended on the house with squeals and thunderings, making the solid walls to quake under their grip, and the rain was flung in solid sheets against the panes. But my work prospered, and after dinner I became immersed in it, heedless of the passage of the hours. And at length, yawning and suddenly aware of fatigue and uneasiness, I again heard the clock in the lounge strike midnight. The wind seemed to have somewhat abated, though still the rain fell heavily, and I pushed aside the blind to look out. The moon, full tonight, though totally obscured behind the rack of clouds, made a twilight in which I could clearly see the huge spouting of the waves above the black edge of the cliff. And there again, on the path outside my window, beaten on by the rain and blown on by the gale, stood the figure I had seen the night before. Her long coat, I noticed, hung straight and undisturbed by the wind. The edge of her motor veil reposed quietly on her shoulders, as if the wild fury of the storm was powerless to touch that dire tranquillity. After a moment she moved slowly away, disappearing towards the corner of the hotel, round which lay the front door. I let the blind drop, and stood there with some icy horror of the spirit closing round me. For I knew, not by ocular evidence alone of that windless isolation in the storm, but by some interior sense, that I'd looked upon a visitor from that dim region beyond time and space, which is invested with our terror of death and of the kingdom of its mute citizens. But mixed with that horror was an overwhelming curiosity. Whose was the spirit, I asked myself, which stood tranquil in the cauldron of the winds, and which on some dread errand of her own had clothed herself again in the sheath of mortality? And to whom was her errand, and how would she accomplish it? Where, too, had she gone now, and where would she reappear again? All this, churning through my conscience, mingled with my terror, stiffening into a certain courage. The terror was there all the while, ready to freeze me, but curiosity controlled it. The lounge, dimly lit, looked to me at first to be empty. Then I saw that the hall porter was sitting in a chair at the foot of the staircase, asleep. There was no occasion for me to disturb him, and I had already set foot on the bottom step for my ascent when there came, on the front door, 2 raps, distinct but not loud. Instantly, with a further qualm of fright, my mind suggested that the knocker at this late hour was she whom I'd seen on the walk outside. Yet how absurd a notion! Here, no doubt, was some unexpected guest arriving late. And then I saw that the porter had awoke and was listening. Someone's arrived, I said. There's someone knocking. He shook his head. No one's expected tonight, sir, he said. That's but the wind, rattling the shutters. Even as he spoke, the two raps were repeated, and on the heels of them came the faint tingle of an electric bell. And is the wind ringing the bell? I asked. A strange thing. I tell you, there's someone outside. He stood there a moment, evidently on the strain, and then pulled himself together. I seem to hear the bell too, he said. I'll see what it can be, though I think it was only some bell on the landing upstairs. He turned up the light just inside the door, then, drawing back the bolts, threw it open. The illumination streamed strongly out, and standing with him on the threshold, I saw there was no one there. The space of gravel for some yards in front was clearly lit, round in the wet and roaring darkness. I felt sure no one could have hidden himself. So short was the interval between the summons and the opening of the door. But now, to make assurance surer, the porter switched on the light outside the porch, and for 50 yards in every direction the lawn and the gravel sweep sprang into brightness. It was just a bell from the landing, sir, he said, and the rattle of the wind. Certainly, that seemed likely. Yet, even while this demonstration of the empty night shone round me, I felt that, invisibly but somewhere close at hand, was the presence that had manifested itself on the other side of the hotel 3 minutes before. Just then the porter quenched the light outside, and in the darkness something pushed by between him and me. What was that? I rapped out, and turning saw in the lit hall behind, shadowy and wavering of outline, the figure which I'd twice seen before. Even as I looked it grew clearer and more solid, and there, with face turned towards us and eyes directed not on me but my companion, stood the woman in cloak and motor veil. The eyes protruded, the mouth gaped as if starving for air, the face was flushed with a mottled purple. Round this death mask of one strangled was wound the pink motor veil, through which I saw the sheen of notable pearls clasping the neck. It was in some such catalepsy as belongs to nightmare that I stood staring at this head of horror, and then I heard, close behind me, a gasp and a hoarse, whispered exclamation. "O God! O Christ!" it said, and the man who stood by me crouched and stole away, out of sight into the tumultuous darkness. The phantom moved. It came forward, passed through the glass screen that shielded the door, and followed. Now fear, like all other pains of body and mind, defeats itself as an instrument for anguish, because when it's reached a certain point some sort of numbness succeeds. Just as to the tortured body on the rack comes the failure of the nerves to register pain any more. Thus, it was not with any semblance of courage now, but with unconcern, that I, in my turn, followed that strangled image of wrath and retaliation. Into the roar of the tempest we passed, and now, borne to me on the wind, there came from somewhere ahead thin squeals as of mere animal terror, not human. There, just in front, were the cliffs, with the background of the whitened sea and the curtain of spray, and for 1 second I caught sight of the fleeing figure of the doomed man outlined against them. His hands shot up in one supreme gesture of despair, and then vanished. Vanished also now was his pursuer, and, what was more, the sense of his pursuer. The terror cleared off from my mind like a frosty breath, and I knew only that a man, human like myself, had fallen over the cliff's edge. I crawled to the top of it, and by the dim moonlight that pierced the clouds I could see, some 30 feet below the sheer brink, the man lying huddled on the showers of spray that spurted from the rocks just beyond. It seemed impossible to reach him without assistance, and even if I had managed to climb down without disaster, there was nothing I could do. Accordingly, I ran back to the hotel, pealing on the bell at the entrance, and in the bureau I found a switch labelled Emergency. I pressed my finger and held it there till I heard the creak of the lift and the thud of footsteps on the stairs. Then ropes were fetched, and blankets, in which could be lifted that which we should find below, and a couple of men, one a doctor who was staying at the hotel, and myself, were lowered. Under his direction we slung the body in a hammock of blankets and waited there until those above on the cliff had conveyed their burden into the hotel. The man had stirred. He'd groaned as we adjusted the rough transport, and seeing me beside him, he'd signed to me to come close and had whispered, "Close here, in a rock pool full of seaweed." He died during the night, leaving that legacy of 6 words, and next morning I found a way down to that sandy inlet where he'd fallen. Close to it was a very big rock pool, hidden away in a labyrinth of slippery ledges and masked with the podded growths of the sea. But at one point the thick harvest of brown tendrils strangely bulged out of the water, and among them I saw some pink tissue, as of a silk veil. I convinced myself of what lay below, and went back to the hotel to give my information. In the interval, they'd searched among the effects of the dead man for the purpose of telegraphing to his relatives, and at the bottom of his trunk, which was pushed under his bed, was a string of pearls. Now, any complete reconstruction of my story is necessarily a matter of guesswork, while the circumstances, as related above, which led to the solution of the disappearance of Miss Alice Trellings, would no doubt be laughed to scorn by any jury of sensible Englishmen. Yet they were very oddly confirmed by the inquest held over her swollen body, which I'd seen pushing up the seaweed of that rock pool, and it was established that she had met her death not by drowning, but by strangulation. Again, the night porter knew that the corpse lay there, for the last words he spoke were to say there was something in the rock pool close at hand, while the pearls found in his trunk, which were proved to be those of the murdered woman and to have been worn by her on the last evening of her life, were sufficient to complete the chain of evidence as to the identity of the murderer. But all these disclosures were due to an apparition in which no sensible man could possibly believe. For the rest, we are obliged to fall back on conjecture as to the actual place and manner of the crime, but such conjecture, if it fits the facts, is bounded within very narrow limits. The murderer was certainly on duty on the night when the crime was committed, and since the strangled body was found in the place indicated by him, close to the beach hotel, it would follow that Miss Trellings arrived at Poltreath, was admitted, and strangled by the porter, who possessed himself of her pearls. He then carried the body down to the beach and hid it under the thick curtain of seaweed in that sequestered pool, difficult of access, about which he whispered to me. He had then to dispose of her motor car, which of course must not be found near the hotel, and this he apparently drove to that bend in the road where it was found the next day, and by leaving it pointing in the direction from which Miss Trellings had come, walked back to the beach hotel. A better device, whether arrived at haphazardly or by subtle calculation, could scarcely have been planned, for it put the police on an entirely wrong scent, and led them to suppose that Miss Trellings had abandoned her idea of going to Poltreath and had turned again in the direction of Bude. That she'd suffered before from loss of memory gave them an additional wrong clue as to her disappearance. But of the phantom itself, which I personally saw twice on the gravel walk alongside my windows, and of its third and avenging appearance when the murderer saw it also, I have no explanation to offer. It seems a terrible fate for the actual spirit of the dead that it must haunt, unless of its own free will, the scene of its corporeal death, though there is a justice no less terrible that it should be the means of vengeance. Even without that ghostly interference, human justice, slower-footed, would probably have overtaken the murderer, but I can imagine no fear of the gallows, no ticking away of the hours of his last night on earth, so awful for the condemned as that pursuit of him through the night of gale and tempest, which elicited those squeals of animal terror. Nor again can I come to any conclusion as to how the apparition of vengeance made itself visible to mortal eyes. Whether it was the image of the woman in cloak and motor veil which was transferred from the mind of the murderer to me, so that I visualized something that had no objective existence, or whether some glimpse into the unseen coming first to me and subsequently to him revealed not a subjective impression, but the manifestation of a living spirit, angry and intent on vengeance. If so, we can only hope that it is now at rest in that world which lies so closely round us, hidden by the merciful veil which sometimes is momentarily lifted.